I was in disbelief when I saw my wife dancing with another man at the company couples dance, so I went up to them and said, "It's great to know you have a new dance partner." She looked embarrassed, her expression surprised when she saw me, and then replied, "He's just a friend I'm dancing with." But her eyes wavered. And it was in that waver, in that second she looked away, that something inside me snapped. When we got home, I tried to convince myself it was just a dance, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the way she avoided the subject and the way her fingers trembled as she touched her phone made me understand that, behind the curtain of normalcy she tried to maintain, there was something much bigger going on. I couldn't sleep that night, not because of insomnia, but because my chest burned as if the air were acidic and the silence of the early morning screamed the truths I was trying not to hear. She slept peacefully, as if life were still intact, and I, standing in the hallway, watched her with the eyes of someone who had just lost everything without a single word having been spoken. In the days that followed, I became a stranger in my own home. I observed everything, the schedules, the messages, the silences too long between words, the disconnected calls when I entered the room. And then the truth hit me like a punch in the gut: he wasn't just a friend, he was the man my wife was leaving me for. It was no longer a doubt, it was a certainty. I saw the messages, the scheduled dates, the excuses made to leave the house, the smiles that were no longer mine. My heart shattered into pieces so small that not even time, with all its arrogance, could rebuild them. And while she slept once more, serene as a trader unaware of the storm she was causing, I made my decision. I packed some clothes in a suitcase, left my ring on the kitchen table, and left. I made no noise. I left no letter. There was nothing more to say. The divorce letter arrived days later. She didn't believe me at first, tried calling me, tried chasing me, but I wouldn't talk. For the first time in years, I chose myself. She stayed with her new partner for a while, and I watched from a distance, silent, letting life decide its own things. And it did. Because what begins with betrayal ends in distrust. The beautiful days she dreamed of with him became a daily nightmare. The promises he made dissolved into selfishness and absence. He wasn't the man she idealized, he was simply the opposite of me. What she saw as excitement turned into imbalance. And what seemed like freedom became abandonment. She saw everything she built with me crumble like a house of cards, and looking back, she realized that the solid house, made of patience, care, and true love, had been mine. Over time, she tried to reach out to me again. She sent long messages, heavy words filled with guilt and nostalgia, saying she missed me, that she didn't know what had gotten into her, that that other man never valued her as I did, that what she wanted most was a second chance. But time is cruel to those who waste what is rare. And when she tried to win me back, she was left speechless upon discovering that I had rediscovered an old love from my youth. A love that life had taken from me prematurely, but that fate, generous and merciless, had now brought back. When she found out, she was paralyzed. She hadn't expected this. Perhaps she believed I would be waiting for her, that my love was eternal, that an apology would be enough for everything to go back to the way it was before. But no. I was no longer the man who was betrayed. I was the man who survived. But what she never expected, was the look in our daughter's eyes. The girl who had once been inspired by her mother to be strong and determined now carried in her eyes the disappointment of someone who had seen her world crumble. It wasn't immediate, but little by little, my daughter began to understand what had happened. She heard conversations, felt the silences, read messages left by mistake, and then one day, she came to me with teary eyes and a trembling voice, and said, "Dad, now I understand everything." I hugged her as if trying to protect her from the impact of that broken world. And even without saying it directly, she began to pull away from her mother. Silently, but painfully. The words grew cold, the hugs became brief, and her mother's house, where she had previously slept on weekends, became merely a stopping point. One day, when her mother insisted that she return to sleep there, the answer came like a bolt of lightning: "It's not the house, it's what I see in it now." And I can't sleep peacefully anymore knowing what you did to the man who was always by your side. Despite everything, my daughter never stopped loving her mother. But something had been broken, and forgiveness, when it came, wasn't redemption, it was simply understanding. She forgave her, but made it clear, in a calm and firm tone, I forgive you, Mom. But my example of love, of manhood, and of loyalty, is my father. It was then that my ex-wife understood that the price of betrayal goes far beyond lost love, it takes its toll on the soul, on dignity, and, above all, on the mirror. Because there is no greater pain than realizing that your own daughter, the one who once dreamed of being like you, now carries shame when looking you in the eye. And yet, even with all this, she tried to win me back. She still thought she could go back in time, undo the damage, put back together the pieces she herself had trampled. But the pieces cut. And they cut deep. Because I was no longer the same. I was someone else. A man rebuilt from suffering, and this new me, no longer fit into the space she offered. Today, I remain by the side of someone who, even in the past, left me with good memories. I rebuilt love slowly, with someone who never hurt me, just got swept away by life. And now, when I meet my ex-wife's gaze, I see the same hesitation as before. But it's no longer guilt. It's longing. Longing for what she herself destroyed. And the most curious thing, is that it all began with a simple dance. A song. A moment. That lifted the veil from our eyes and revealed that, behind what seemed like just an exchange of steps, there was an exchange of destinies. But what happened in the end, was even more unexpected. Because the true impact of the betrayal only revealed itself when she believed she could still salvage something. And what she discovered, was not only that her love was gone, but that it had found a much better place to flourish. A place she would never be a part of again. And what happened to the daughter? Did she rebuild her relationship with her mother? Was there any redemption possible? Or did the shadow of betrayal stretch across generations? That is the story you're about to hear. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of treason is supported, on the contrary, we exalt the value of loyalty and respect. The stories told are fictional, but the feelings are real, and the moral is clear. Betrayal destroys homes, loves and even the identity of those who commit it. Now take a deep breath, and get ready to hear a shocking story, intense and unforgettable. Lucas was the kind of man who didn't go unnoticed, not because of his appearance, which was discreet, but because of a quiet presence that exuded confidence. At 42, he had achieved a stable position built through years of effort and sacrifice. He worked as a civil engineer, methodical, committed to everything he set out to do, including love. His relationship with Laura had begun like so many others, simply, in a corner cafe, on a summer afternoon when their eyes met by chance and the silence between them seemed more meaningful than any words. Laura was a literature teacher, and her gaze held a beautiful melancholy, the kind that tells stories without the lips needing to move. She had a calm way of observing the world, but also a temperament that demanded surrender, intensity, presence. When she loved, it was completely. Their marriage wasn't made of explosions or exaggerated promises. It was something deeper, built on details, on a daily basis, in the way he made coffee while she finished grading papers at night, in the way she left notes in his pockets with excerpts from books she thought he should read. It was a love that seemed delicately designed, as if they had been molded to fit into each other's gaps. Their lives were filled with routines that didn't bore, but rather comforted. Friday nights were reserved for wine and conversation, Sunday mornings for warm bread and walks. It wasn't a perfect relationship, because perfection doesn't exist, but it was a caring one. There was respect, listening, laughter, and, above all, there was history. They lived in a leafy neighborhood, in a two-story house with large windows and light-colored walls. Laura had chosen every detail of the decor with silent care, as if preparing the home not only for the present, but for the years to come. Their daughter, Isabella, was the strongest bond between them. At 16, she had inherited her father's sense of justice and her mother's sensitivity to perceive what was unsaid. She was an observant, affectionate, and, at the same time, quite critical girl. She loved them both deeply and considered her parents her greatest example of affection and partnership. She saw their marriage as a rare example of complicity in times of fragile relationships, and it was common to see her smiling when she heard them exchanging jokes in the kitchen while preparing dinner. The family routine was calm, almost predictable, but never cold. There was warmth in small gestures. Lucas always arrived home before 7, and before entering, he would stand for a few seconds gazing at the light from the living room window, as if silently giving thanks for having somewhere to return. Laura, for her part, set the mood subtly, sometimes with soft music, sometimes with the aroma of freshly baked cake that seemed to embrace whoever walked through the door. During dinner, they talked about everything: politics, literature, TV shows, future projects. They rarely argued, and when they did, they were always careful not to cross the line into something hurtful. They learned to disagree without hurting each other, which was rare but valuable. Isabella carefully observed how her parents handled time. For her, who was just discovering herself in the world, it seemed like a promise that love could indeed be cultivated, even after years. She grew up watching her father open the car door for her mother, even though no one else did. She grew up watching her mother put her cell phone away at dinner, because nothing is more important than now, as she said. And so, when Lucas's company ball approached, everyone treated the event as just another ordinary evening, the kind where the couple got ready together. He complimented her dress as he straightened his tie, and Isabella took pictures of the two of them with that silent pride in her eyes. The invitation had arrived a month earlier, and Lucas had been reluctant to accept. He wasn't a fan of social events, but he knew that, from time to time, it was necessary to attend. Laura, on the other hand, had always enjoyed these occasions. She said it was good to see people in different contexts, outside the worn-out routines of everyday life. She planned her dress in advance, went to the salon the day before, and when she came downstairs that night, Lucas looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Isabella applauded playfully and asked to take one last photo before they left. It was a beautiful scene, a portrait that reflected the years of living together, of seamless intimacy, of a marriage that seemed unshakable. In the hall where the event would take place, the music echoed with sophistication, and the yellowish lights created a welcoming atmosphere. Lucas chatted with co-workers, and Laura, with her sociable manner, moved between groups, always with a light smile and kind words. At a certain point, a more danceable song started, and a few couples were invited to the dance floor. Laura approached her husband, extended her hand, but he declined with a tired smile. He said he preferred to watch her, and she, laughing, accepted an acquaintance's invitation to dance. A simple gesture, within a harmless context. Lucas watched the scene calmly, until he noticed something strange. A gesture, a look, a touch that lasted longer than necessary. But he shook his head, banishing the thought, convincing himself it was just his mind creating ghosts. They returned home late that night, and the conversation in the car was brief. They were tired, and the silence seemed natural, like so many others. Laura fell asleep quickly, as usual, and Lucas stayed awake a while longer, reflecting on how much life had changed in recent years. Not out of dissatisfaction, but out of that kind of thought that arises when the world slows down and everything seems to make more noise inside. He thought about his daughter, about the coming years, about how life moved too quickly. The next day began early. Isabella went to school, Lucas to work, and Laura had a school event. Life continued as usual, with its schedules and well-defined commitments. Nothing, at first glance, indicated anything was out of place. The days unfolded within a functional structure. Dinners continued, as did family breakfasts. There were hugs, there were smiles. But there was also a slight distance that seeped in like dust through cracks. Laura seemed more distracted. Sometimes she'd get lost on her phone for long minutes, other times she'd take a while to answer when called. Lucas noticed, but attributed it to fatigue, the accumulation of work, the routine. There was never room for doubt between them, and he was proud of that. He preferred the benefit of trust to harboring unfounded theories. After all, anyone who knows true love knows how silent yet eloquent it is. They know there are forms of communication that don't involve words. Isabella, for her part, was growing closer and closer to her father. She found his comments amusing, liked the way he explained things, how he always made a point of listening to what she had to say. Laura was also present, but there had been a certain rigidity in her gaze lately. A kind of restlessness she tried to hide, but which her daughter, with her natural sensitivity, was beginning to notice. Even without fully understanding, Isabella felt something was changing. There were no fights. There was no yelling. But there was also no longer the same lightness. And that was enough to make her thoughts start to grow restless. On weekends, family walks became more rare. Everyone seemed wrapped up in their own obligations. And yet, the house remained standing, as if time were simply rearranging the internal furniture of relationships. Nothing was obvious enough to cause alarm. But for those familiar with the small gestures, the silences, and the averted glances, everything was beginning to change. There was a subtle disconnect spreading, like a crack beneath the new paint on a wall. Laura maintained her smile, but it seemed more practiced than spontaneous. Lucas remained attentive, but his gaze seemed increasingly searching for something he couldn't quite grasp. Isabella continued to observe. And in that home where love had once been a river in constant flow, the waters began to change direction, albeit slowly. History hadn't yet turned inside out. But it was about to. Because what is true can withstand time, routine, silence. But it doesn't always withstand emotional absence. And it was in this absence, in this unfilled space between two bodies that once loved each other as one, that the greatest storm in that family was brewing. And none of them, not even those who thought they had control of everything, were prepared for what came next. The feeling that something wasn't quite right became more constant, like a buzzing sound Lucas tried to ignore, but which gradually became impossible to ignore. The routine seemed intact at first glance, but there were subtle changes, hard to name but impossible to ignore. Dinners became quieter, breakfasts more rushed. Laura began wearing different perfumes, bolder clothes for everyday events, and while this might go unnoticed to those unfamiliar with her patterns, Lucas noticed. He didn't comment, not for fear of the response, but because he wasn't yet ready to confront the possibility that the comfort they'd built over so many years might be fraying at the edges. Her absence became more frequent, justified by extra meetings, courses, dinners with friends he'd never met. Nothing alarming in itself, but together, they formed an uncomfortable picture. The conversations began to lose depth. Laura smiled as always, but there was a rush in her expression, as if she wanted to end each exchange before it became too personal. Lucas tried to remain calm, to convince himself it was just a phase, but doubt crept in. Isabella noticed her mother's absences, questioning subtly but respecting boundaries. She began to draw even closer to her father, feeling he was quieter, more thoughtful, and this made her uneasy. She began to observe too, with the same sensitivity inherited from her mother, but with her father's rationality. She noticed the inconsistent schedules, the hastily answered messages, the avoidant eyes. And even without understanding everything, she began to piece together pieces that didn't yet form a clear picture, but already outlined a sketch of uncertainty. One Saturday night, Lucas decided not to go to his usual extra work, citing fatigue, which Laura accepted without question. He said he was going out with a friend for dinner and would be back early. She dressed with a style he hadn't seen in a while, impeccable makeup, high heels, and a slight smile. He simply nodded without protest, and she left. Minutes later, he grabbed his coat and keys and walked out the back door. Something inside him needed answers, not guesses. He drove slowly, trying to decide what to do, until an idea occurred to him. He remembered that Laura's cell phone was synced to the family tracking system on the house tablet, something they had done for emergencies when Isabella was younger. He turned on the device in the car, entered the password, and the red dot moved slowly through a neighborhood he knew well. It was a residential area, far from the usual restaurants. He stopped the car on a corner and walked to where the icon indicated. The address was a small, inconspicuous building with lit windows on the second floor. He didn't go upstairs. He stood there, motionless, as if simply being there was enough to confirm everything. He waited for over an hour, until the lights went out. He returned home breathless, a hollow feeling opening up inside his chest, as if something were about to collapse. In the following days, he tried to maintain normalcy. He looked at Laura as if searching for traces of someone he once knew, but who now seemed to hide behind automated gestures. He began to notice contradictions in her speech, vague answers about commitments, exchanged memories that didn't add up. He decided to observe in silence, trying to understand where this was going. He installed a discreet monitoring app on her phone, something he never thought he would do, but which now seemed necessary. The conversations he read there dismantled the last remaining resistances in his mind. She was talking to another man. Carefully, but intimately. She didn't mention names directly, she didn't use compromising expressions, but it was all there, between the lines, in the timing of the messages, in the frequency with which they communicated. There was no longer any doubt. What remained to be seen was how much of that relationship still belonged to him. The following week, Laura began to show more affection. She brought small gifts, prepared dinners, and approached him more affectionately. Lucas found this strange. There was sweetness in her gestures, but no truth. It was as if she were trying to cover something up, compensate, soothe a guilt he now recognized in every whispered word. She kissed him more eagerly, but her eyes offered silent apologies. He accepted everything silently, like someone watching the end of a play they already know the outcome of. And Isabella watched. One day, at dinner, when Laura mentioned a supposed meeting the following Saturday, Lucas simply smiled and said he would drop her off. Silence was immediate. She hesitated, tried to talk her way out of it, saying she would go with a friend, but he insisted, gently, like someone offering a ride to someone they love. She firmly denied him, which he had already expected. The truth was there, in her refusal. On Saturday, when Laura left, Lucas didn't follow her. He no longer needed to. He knew where she would be. He spent the day at home with Isabella, watching movies, making lunch together, and laughing over old memories. At one point, his daughter looked at him for several seconds and asked if he was okay. He replied with a tired smile that he was, and she accepted, but didn't believe him. She could feel a growing pain there, and it bothered her. Later, he went up to the bedroom, grabbed Laura's phone, which was connected to the tablet, and read new messages. The final confirmation. She wasn't just seeing someone. She was involved, deeply involved. The words written were intimate, sincere, and unspoken. She spoke of the future, of feelings, of plans that didn't include him. And Lucas knew. It was the end. When she returned that night, he said nothing. He was sitting on the couch, watching some random documentary, and simply asked if dinner had been good. She said yes, with a smile that avoided her eyes. She went upstairs and took a shower. Lucas remained there, motionless, feeling his own heartbeat like repeated daggers. He slept on the couch that night, or at least pretended to. The next day, he acted normally. But the decision had already been made. During the week, he gathered documents, separated accounts, sought legal advice. There was no fight, no scandal. There would soon be only the clean, silent severing of a relationship that had been bleeding internally for months. At the end of that week, the company couple's dance took place. Laura insisted on going, saying it had been a while since they'd been out together. Lucas agreed. He dressed as he always did, elegant and restrained. She looked stunning, and he noticed, as if he wanted to capture that image for the last time. They arrived together, and for a while, everything seemed normal. They chatted with colleagues, toasted with smiles. Until the music changed and some couples took to the dance floor. Laura invited him with a look, but he shook his head, saying he was tired. She smiled and went to dance with a man who approached naturally. Lucas knew him by sight, a new employee at the company. He watched the dance. It wasn't just a dance. It was an extension of what he'd already read, felt, intuited. And there, amidst so many people, he decided to end it. He approached slowly, a subtle smile on his lips, and upon reaching the two, he said, without changing his tone, how good it was to know she had a new dance partner. Laura stopped immediately. Her body froze. The smile faded. She turned away, her face pale, and simply murmured that he was just a friend she was dancing to a song with. He nodded, saying nothing more, and calmly returned to his seat. But inside, the last bridge had been burned. That night, they drove home together, in silence. He drove calmly, she stared out the window. Neither of them said a word. When they arrived, he went straight upstairs to his room. Laura showered, as if trying to wash away the scene she had just witnessed. When he lay down, Lucas pretended to sleep. But he was awake, his heart racing, his thoughts already elsewhere. The next day would be the beginning of a new life. And something inside him, despite the pain, was ready to start over. But what he didn't yet know was that that moment of rupture, painful as it was, wasn't the true climax of the story. The deepest impact, the most unexpected cut, was yet to come. Because what was about to be revealed wasn't just about the couple, but about what was being silently eroded in the hearts of those least worthy of bearing the weight of disappointment. And when the truth comes out, neither party will be able to emerge unscathed. The night Laura received the divorce decree was silent, dense, almost unbreathable. She sat at the kitchen table with trembling hands, her eyes fixed on the paper that carried not only legal words but the weight of an irreversible choice. No words of rancor, no direct accusations. Just a final point written with the firmness of someone who has endured all they could handle. Lucas was no longer in the house. He had left 2 days earlier, taking only 2 suitcases and the silence of someone who refuses to beg for what has already been ripped from them. Laura tried calling, texting, searching everywhere for the echo of a response that never came. She knew he had found out. She had felt it in his eyes since the dance, but seeing that concrete document before her made the ground fall open for good. She went up to her bedroom, lay down on the bed where they had slept together for so many years, and cried like someone waking from a nightmare, but realizing the real world is even crueler. Isabella watched everything from afar. She didn't say anything to her mother that night, but spent the following days avoiding her mother's gaze, limiting conversations to what was necessary. The girl, who until then had seen Laura as a model of balance and sensitivity, now saw her through a filter of silent frustration. There was no immediate confrontation, but there was no early forgiveness either. There was a growing distance, and Laura felt it as a second punishment, perhaps harsher than the first. She decided not to insist. She would wait. She knew that, in time, her daughter would understand. At least, that's what she wanted to believe. The days dragged on like an endless punishment. Lucas didn't return, didn't call, didn't respond. Not a single sign of anger. Only the piercing silence of someone who no longer wants to share even the sound of their own pain. Laura began spiraling into memories, revisiting moments, trying to pinpoint exactly when everything had fallen apart. But it no longer mattered. She had made a choice. And now she had to deal with the consequences. She tried to move forward with her new relationship, believing that perhaps, with time, things would take shape. But the man she'd become involved with seemed increasingly absent, distracted, and distant from what she imagined he would be. With Lucas, everything was presence. Now, she was surrounded by absences. Months passed. The separation progressed, and Isabella's visits to her mother's house became less frequent. One day, Laura tried to talk to her daughter. She asked her out, proposed lunch. Isabella accepted with a smile that seemed more like a concession than a genuine invitation to affection. During lunch, Laura commented that she had made a mistake, that she knew it, and that she missed her family. Isabella listened in silence, cutting her food with mechanical delicacy, without looking up. When Laura finished, her voice choked and her eyes moist, her daughter simply said she forgave him, but that she now saw her father differently. That he, indeed, was her true role model. Laura smiled sadly, squeezed her daughter's hand across the table, and didn't insist. That simple gesture was like a mirror, it revealed the reflection of a woman who had let the essential slip through her fingers. Time passed a little longer, until news reached Laura's ears through an old mutual friend. Lucas was seeing someone. Not just anyone. It was a woman who had been his first love, back when he was still a teenager. Someone who, due to life's circumstances, had taken a different path, but who now, unexpectedly, resurfaced in his life. Laura's heart sank, but not with jealousy. It was a different, deep pain, an emptiness that echoed through her soul as if cruelly confirming that she had lost the only man who had ever loved her completely. And that now he had been returned to the world, whole, to someone else, because of her. Laura tried to react. She arranged a meeting with Lucas via a polite, almost neutral message. She said she needed to sort out some separation paperwork, but deep down, she just wanted to see him. He accepted. They arranged to meet for coffee in a discreet location. When she arrived, he was already there, sitting calmly, with slightly longer hair and a serenity in his eyes that startled her. He greeted her politely but without warmth. She tried to make conversation, talking about Isabella, about the progress of the process. He responded simply, without delving into details. When she tried to get closer emotionally, telling him she still loved him, he simply stared at her and said there were things that couldn't be undone. She apologized sincerely, saying she deeply regretted it. He replied that he understood, but that forgiveness isn't reconciliation. And it was at that moment that a voice interrupted them. A young, delicate voice, coming from the door of the cafe. Isabella entered, searching until she located her father. She walked over to him, holding a folder in her hands. She had arranged to meet him there to deliver some school documents. Seeing the two of them together, she froze for a second. Laura smiled shyly, calling her daughter a hesitant "hi." Isabella responded with a brief wave but didn't sit down. She handed the papers to her father, and before leaving, she looked into her mother's eyes. Laura called her name, her tone distressed. She said she needed to talk, that she couldn't stand the distance between them any longer. Isabella took a deep breath, looked at her father, and then back at her mother. It was there, in that moment, that the true climax began. Because Isabella didn't just respond. She opened up. With a firm but shaky voice, she said that for months she tried to understand, tried to forgive, tried to move on. That she understood that adults make mistakes, that marriages can wear down. But what really hurt her, what knocked her off her feet, was being used. Laura stood still. She didn't understand right away. But then her daughter continued. She said that, some time ago, Laura had shared with her her desire to see someone else. She said she was confused, that she thought Lucas no longer loved her, that she needed excitement, a breather. And she asked for help. She asked Isabella to distract him, to be understanding, not to mention it to her father. She said it was a one-off, just one night, just a moment. And her daughter, not understanding the weight of it, not knowing the gravity of what was being asked, accepted. She did what her mother wanted. She helped hide it. When it was over, Isabella said she was never the same after that. That upon realizing what she had done, upon understanding that she had participated in her own father's downfall, guilt settled over her. That the look in his eyes when he discovered everything carried a pain that torments her to this day. That she spent sleepless nights crying, wishing she could go back in time. That she tried to distance herself from her mother because every time she looked at her, she felt ashamed. And that, even though she had forgiven in part, she could never admire someone who used their own daughter as a shield to commit a mistake that destroyed the family. Laura, now with shocked eyes, tried to justify herself. She said she was fragile, that she thought it was something unimportant, that she didn't want to hurt anyone. But her words seemed hollow against the solidity of what had been exposed. Lucas remained silent throughout the conversation. He watched his daughter with teary eyes, but didn't interrupt. When Isabella finished, she said she now understood her father. That he did the right thing by leaving. And that if he was with someone else, she hoped he was happy. That he deserved someone who truly loved him, without confusion, without cowardice. He turned to his mother one last time and said he still loved her, but that now it was his father who held the role model in his heart. Then he left. Not crying, not shouting. Just leaving, with the firmness of someone carrying wounds that have learned to heal. Laura remained there, sitting motionless, her face bathed in tears. She tried to look at Lucas, but he stood, thanked her for the coffee, and left in silence. The pain wasn't just the end of a marriage, nor the loneliness that would follow her from then on. It was the loss of her daughter's respect. It was the knowledge that involving her in her thoughtless choice had not only destroyed a home but also corrupted the innocence of those who still believed in their parents' love as a structure. And now, not even she knew how to fix it. Because the damage had already been done. And time, cruel as it is, would only serve to remind her, every day, that she hadn't just betrayed her husband. He also betrayed the admiring look of his own daughter. Laura remained seated for long minutes after Lucas and Isabella left. The silence in the cafe seemed louder than any music, as if all the surrounding conversations had been drowned out by that intimate, uncontrollable whirlwind. Her hands, still on the table, were cold and still, as if they no longer belonged to her. For the first time, she felt she had lost everything, and not just because of the betrayal. What hurt most wasn't the divorce itself, nor even Lucas's physical absence, it was the gaping hole between her and her daughter, an emotional rupture that left visible scars even without blood. Losing a man's love was something she could perhaps bear with time, but losing a daughter's respect, being seen as a disappointment by someone who once looked up to her, that was unbearable. In the following days, Laura tried to return to her routine, but everything felt too empty. The apartment she'd stayed in after the separation now felt like a prison of memories that insisted on haunting her at every turn. She tried writing to Isabella, long letters that she'd finish and then tear up. She sent short, harmless messages, asking about school, about her studies, but the answers were curt, direct, and sometimes they didn't come at all. She started attending therapy sessions, something she'd never considered before. There, between four silent walls, she began to unearth guilt and understand that the betrayal hadn't been an isolated act. It was the culmination of an accumulation of bad choices, of a lack of courage to face what was wrong, of running away instead of fixing it. And what she'd lost wasn't just a family, but a part of herself that would never be recovered. Meanwhile, Lucas continued his life discreetly, as always. He remained focused on work, reorganizing his days according to a new reality. He still bore the scars of what had happened, but he no longer allowed himself to be controlled by them. He had reconnected with Elisa, a friend from his youth with whom he had exchanged letters and confessions in his early adulthood. They had lost touch over time, but they met again by chance at a professional event, and little by little, her presence became constant. Elisa was sensitive, mature, and didn't try to take up anyone's space, she simply made herself present. The relationship grew gently, unhurriedly, as if they both knew that only time would cement something new. Lucas didn't talk much about the past, but Elisa sensed the depth of the wounds in his silences. And so, she respected each stage, without intruding, without demanding. Little by little, she was rebuilding not only her trust and love, but above all, the peace he believed he could no longer find. Isabella grew closer and closer to her father. She spent entire weekends at his house, cooking together, watching old movies, and talking about everything. Elisa's presence had also become part of this new dynamic. Isabella welcomed her with curiosity at first, and with time and familiarity, she grew to like her. Elisa never forced intimacy, never tried to become a second mother. She simply treated her with respect and genuinely listened. And this won over Isabella, who began to trust her as someone with whom she could share not only doubts but also joys. The house was now lighter, filled with spontaneous conversations and natural smiles. There was no replacement of anyone, but rather a new construction, based on truth. One afternoon, after school, Isabella decided to visit her mother. She hadn't been in for over 3 weeks. Laura answered the door with tired eyes, but her eyes lit up when she saw her. Isabella came in, sat on the sofa, and remained silent for a few seconds. Laura offered her water, juice, anything that would make her stay longer. Her daughter gently declined. She said she was there because, despite everything, there was still love. And that's why she no longer wanted to maintain an aggressive distance. Laura cried immediately, trying to get closer, but Isabella put her hand up, as if to say, "Calm down." She said what hurt her most wasn't the mistake of betrayal itself, but the manipulation, the request that she hide it. That this made her feel part of the guilt, and that it was difficult to forgive herself before forgiving her mother. Laura listened without interrupting, like someone who realizes they've said too much for too long. Isabella then shared something Laura hadn't expected. She said she was afraid of repeating the same mistakes. That sometimes she found herself sabotaging relationships for fear of being like her mother, and that this haunted her. Laura tried to console her, saying that her mistakes shouldn't cast a shadow over her daughter's life. But Isabella was firm. "I love you, Mom. But I don't want to be like you in that way. I want to build something better." Laura nodded, her eyes welling, and for the first time, she understood the depth of the hole she had created. But in that same moment, she also realized there was still a chance to build a bridge, albeit a narrower, slower one. A bridge that connected not to a lost past, but to a possible future. Months passed. Laura resumed her career, invested in courses, and sought to regain control of her life without relying on any other relationship. For the first time in years, she looked at herself seriously, without fantasizing. She understood that the biggest mistake of her life wasn't just betraying a faithful man, but also walking away from the person she had once promised to be. She no longer harbored hope of winning Lucas back. She knew that chapter was closed. And somehow, accepting this also freed her. She understood that pain needed to be turned into a lesson, that regret without change was just vanity. She began to dedicate more time to her daughter, without pressure, without asking for her back, simply being sincerely present. And little by little, affection returned. Not as it was before, but as something possible, real. Lucas, on the other hand, was immersing himself deeper into this new phase of his life. He and Elisa traveled together for the first time, a peaceful week by the sea, where they talked about their hopes for the future. He spoke of Isabella, of her importance, of how she was the priority in his life. Elisa listened attentively, moved, and said she admired her even more for everything she had overcome. Lucas allowed himself to smile without guilt. For the first time in a long time, he felt it was possible to be happy again without carrying the weight of the past with every step. The final reunion took place on Isabella's birthday. She wanted something small, intimate, with a few friends and her parents. Laura arrived later, with a simple but lovingly chosen gift. Lucas was there with Elisa. There was no tension, just an air of restrained respect. During the birthday song, Isabella pulled them both into the photo. A symbolic yet powerful gesture. When she looked at the photos later, alone in her room, she realized something that made her breathe a sigh of relief. Despite everything, she had survived. And more than that, she had grown. The love she saw in her father was now a reference point. The strength she found to forgive her mother had matured her. And Elisa's presence showed her that new beginnings could be true. Laura, returning home that night, smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because everything was back to normal, but because she now understood what she needed to do, no longer try to repair what was broken, but to build from the pieces. And so, silently, she accepted that losing Lucas was the price for not recognizing herself in time. But winning back, even in part, her daughter, was the chance to save what was left of herself. The pain was still there, but now it was a reminder, not a prison. And that, in itself, was the beginning of something new. The morning after the birthday party, as light streamed through the windows and the remnants of the celebration still lingered throughout the house, Isabella sat for a while on the bedroom floor, looking through the photos on her phone. She flipped through the images one by one, not in a rush or anxiety, but as if examining the details, searching for hidden feelings in their expressions. The joy in Lucas's eyes was visible. There was a serenity built not by the absence of pain, but by true overcoming. Beside Elisa, his smile wasn't the same as I'd seen in old photos of him with his mother. It was more restrained, less euphoric, but also more genuine. There was affection, respect, and a kind of peace Isabella had never noticed in him before. And when she saw the image of the three of them, she, her father, and Elisa, appearing side by side smiling, she realized that her new family wasn't smaller or inferior. It was simply another way of being happy. A new structure, full of scars, but still whole in its own way. That same morning, Lucas walked along the porch while Elisa made coffee. The smell of toast filled the kitchen, mixed with the soft sound of music playing in the background. He leaned on the railing with a cup in his hands and watched the still sleepy street. He was thinking about how everything had changed in such a short time. The weight of betrayal was no longer a chain on his feet, but a memory that gave him clarity about who he was and everything he was willing to protect from then on. Elisa walked out onto the porch and approached him without saying anything, just resting her head on his shoulder. And in that silent gesture, Lucas felt a complicity that reconnected him with something he had lost long ago, trust. Meanwhile, Laura spent Sunday in silence, sitting on the sofa with an open book, unable to read a single line. The apartment was clean, organized, but cold, like a setting that simulates comfort without truly offering it. She picked up her phone a few times, thinking about sending her daughter a message, but couldn't find words that wouldn't sound invasive. She knew that rebuilding their relationship needed to be delicate, without urgency, respecting the boundaries Isabella herself had imposed. There was no more room for dramatization, much less for impulsive attempts at winning her back. All that remained now was waiting. And waiting, when fraught with guilt, was one of the most painful feelings to endure. Over time, small changes began to emerge. Isabella began responding to messages more kindly again, still without much intimacy, but with less emotional distance. One Saturday, she agreed to go out for ice cream with her mother, and although the conversation was superficial, it was a step forward. Laura began attending support groups, not as penance, but as a way to understand what had happened to her. For the first time, she stopped seeking external justifications and began to face the questions she had so long avoided: what made her give up what she had, why she was unable to dialogue with her own emptiness, why she placed her personal crisis in the hands of someone else instead of courageously confronting her discomfort. The answers came slowly, painful but liberating. She understood that, although the mistake had been serious, it was the result of a much earlier internal disconnection, a lack of identity masked by years of convenience and routine. At work, Lucas was promoted. He took on a new position with more responsibilities, but which also allowed for more flexible hours. He took advantage of his free mornings to walk with Elisa, read with Isabella, or simply take care of the house. The internal transformation was reflected in everything around him. He had become more observant, less reactive. He knew that his new phase of life required emotional balance. He was more selective with his relationships, more attentive to signs of fatigue, to his own silence. Elisa noticed this with admiration. At times, she sensed that Lucas still carried remnants of a pain he didn't share, but she never pressured him. She let time do the work of healing what wasn't hers to fix. And because of this, he trusted her in a way he never imagined trusting anyone again. Laura, in one of her therapy sessions, was challenged to write a letter to Lucas. Not to send, but to try to organize everything she felt. He spent hours staring at the blank slate. When he finally began, the words came rushing out. He didn't write a superficial apology. He wrote about his fear of growing old without purpose, about the feeling of being invisible, about how he began to drift away from his own essence without realizing it. She confessed her shame for having involved her daughter, for having let herself be carried away by an illusion. At the end of the letter, she wrote that she expected neither forgiveness nor friendship, but simply wanted him to know that the love she felt hadn't been a lie, it just hadn't been strong enough to prevent her from making the biggest mistake of her life. He put the letter in a drawer, but the simple act of writing it was a catharsis. The following month, Isabella began sharing small parts of her routine with her mother. She talked about school, books she was reading, new songs. Laura listened attentively, without interrupting, without trying to force deeper conversations. And this respect began to bring them closer. One afternoon, while they were walking in the park, Isabella asked if her mother still blamed herself. Laura replied that she did, but that the guilt had now changed. Before, it was paralyzing, now it was a reminder that choices have consequences. She said she no longer wanted to punish herself, but rather to use everything she learned to be a better woman. Isabella looked at her for a few seconds and said that, even though she couldn't forget what happened, she could see that there was real effort involved. An effort that she, deep down, admired. Lucas and Elisa decided to take a short trip to celebrate their first anniversary. They chose a simple, peaceful place where they could disconnect from the world for a few days. Isabella encouraged her father to go, telling him he deserved to experience something good. And when he returned from the trip, he brought her a gift, a necklace with a leaf-shaped pendant, a symbol of the idea that everything in life can fall, but can also be reborn. She smiled when she received it, hugged her father, and for the first time told him she was happy for him. Lucas, overcome with emotion, hugged her back tightly. He knew his daughter had grown up difficultly, but now blossomed with more wisdom than many adults around her. That same week, Isabella extended an invitation to her mother, a school play, where she would play the lead. Laura cried instantly. She felt that, although she hadn't yet fully regained her lost space, she was forging a new path. On the day of the performance, Lucas was in the audience with Elisa. Laura arrived later, discreetly, and sat distantly but attentively. When Isabella entered the stage, the two parents' eyes met for a brief second. There were no words, no wave. Only the recognition that, despite everything, they had created someone extraordinary together. And in that moment, guilt gave way to silent pride. It wasn't full forgiveness, it wasn't reconciliation, but it was the beginning of a more mature acceptance, where the pains of the past no longer determined what could or couldn't blossom in the future. And so it was, amid silences that now hurt less, amid small gestures and new, conscious choices, that everyone's lives began to reorganize. Not as they were before, not with the promise of a fresh start identical to the past, but with the awareness that loving, sometimes, also means knowing how to let go. And that rebuilding, however slowly, is always possible, as long as one acknowledges the mistake, accepts the pain, and, above all, is willing to walk again, even with feet still bleeding. The real dilemma now was no longer about betrayal, loss, or forgiveness. It was about what each person would do with what remained after the storm. And the answer to that was still being written. The school auditorium slowly emptied after the performance. The final applause still echoed like a gentle caress in Isabella's ears, as she watched the emptying seats from behind the curtain, her heart still racing. It wasn't just the nervousness of the performance that made her breathe deeply, but the certainty that, in that audience, the two most important people in her life had shared the same space, a physical and emotional space that, for a long time, she thought would never exist again. She knew there were still wounds between them, walls built with words and silences, but the mere fact that they had been there, together, for her, meant more than any forced reconciliation. When she finally left the stage, she walked firmly down the backstage corridor, meeting Lucas and Elisa in the main hall. She hugged her father tightly, then greeted Elisa with a tender smile. Laura waited a little further away, standing with a bouquet of simple flowers in her hands, her gaze anxious and uncertain. When their eyes met, Isabella walked up to her mother, accepted the flowers, thanked her with a kiss on the cheek, and remained silent. Laura wanted to say something more, but held back. She simply smiled. This wasn't the time for speeches, the gesture spoke volumes. In the days that followed, Isabella and Laura's interactions became more frequent, and even if brief, they carried a different quality. It was no longer an obligation, nor a desperate attempt at redemption, but a slow, real construction. Isabella began visiting her mother on Sundays. They would have lunch together at simple restaurants or cook at home, chatting about everyday life, movies, and books. Laura learned to listen more than speak, something that had never been her strong point. She let her daughter express herself without correction, without trying to guide the narrative. It was as if, finally, she understood that a mother's love wasn't domination, but shelter. And because of this new listening, he began to recognize nuances in Isabella that he had never noticed before, the delicate sarcasm that hit her sensitivity, her ability to analyze situations with a maturity unusual for her age, the way she held pain without letting it define her. He came to admire her not only as a daughter, but as a woman in the making. And that, for Laura, was a kind of quiet redemption. One afternoon, after one of these lunches, they were washing the dishes together when Isabella asked, in a low voice, if her mother missed her father. The question was posed naturally, as if wanting to understand rather than judge. Laura paused for a second, holding a still wet plate in her hands, and answered with the frankness she now allowed herself, every day. She explained that she missed him not only as a partner, but as a friend, as a life partner. She said that for a long time, she believed she could experience something more intense, more exciting, but that she discovered, the hard way, that intensity was not synonymous with truth. And that, by seeking something outside herself, she lost what she most needed to cultivate within herself. Isabella simply nodded, without delving deeper into the subject. But Laura felt that, somehow, that answer had resonated with her daughter. And that comforted her more than any explicit forgiveness. Meanwhile, Lucas was growing deeper and deeper into his relationship with Elisa. They now had their own rhythm, a harmony built on patience and complicity. Elisa wasn't the kind of woman who idealized perfect loves. She'd already experienced failed relationships, subtle betrayals, and suffocating silences. That's why her presence by Lucas's side was so valuable. She knew the value of every emotional achievement. She didn't demand daily declarations from him, but she knew when he needed silence, when a hot coffee or a touch on the shoulder would suffice. Lucas, in turn, was learning to trust again, not only her, but his own judgment. He let himself be carried away by simple moments, by quiet late afternoon strolls, by leisurely coffees shared. And for the first time, he felt he no longer carried the guilt of the separation as a burden. He was whole for someone who welcomed him exactly as he was, with flaws, with fears, but also with an enormous desire to be happy again. One long weekend, Elisa invited him to visit her hometown. It was a small village surrounded by mountains and trails, where her parents and older sister lived. Lucas hesitated at first, but eventually accepted. The trip was peaceful, and the welcome warm. There, amidst a more bucolic routine, he felt a kind of peace he hadn't felt in decades. They walked trails, picked fruit in the garden, went to bed early, and laughed at simple things. During one of those afternoons, as they watched the sunset in silence, Elisa asked if he felt happy. Lucas didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath and said he was at peace, and that perhaps this was the most mature form of happiness he had ever experienced. Elisa smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and told him it was all she wanted for him. And in that moment, he knew he was where he was meant to be. Laura, on the other hand, found herself facing an unexpected emotional dilemma. An old college friend, with whom she had lost touch years ago, reconnected with her through social media. They began chatting, exchanging memories, and talking about life. He was kind, polite, and interested in getting to know her better. Laura was flattered but hesitant. She felt she wasn't ready for something new yet, not because of Lucas, but because she didn't want to get lost in another story again. She shared this doubt with Isabella in an informal conversation. Isabella listened attentively and, with an almost imperceptible smile, said that perhaps what her mother needed wasn't to start over with someone, but to finish rebuilding herself alone. Laura listened and understood. The presence of a new man wouldn't solve what still needed to be healed within her. And for the first time, she chose not to follow impulse, but to follow the process. A few months later, on a rainy afternoon, Isabella had an anxiety attack before an important test. She called her father, who was in a meeting. Elisa answered the phone and, upon hearing the girl's trembling voice, dropped everything and went to meet her. She arrived at school drenched in rain, entered the teacher's lounge, and asked to speak with Isabella. The principal, recognizing her as Lucas's partner, allowed her. Elisa sat with Isabella in the hallway, hugged her, and stayed there for almost an hour, listening, soothing, breathing together. When Lucas arrived, he found them both sitting on the floor, smiling through tears. In that moment, he understood that Elisa was already part of his daughter's life, not as a substitute, but as a support, a woman who was there out of genuine love, without competition, without pretense. Isabella looked at him with moist eyes and simply said, "She helped me a lot today." And that was enough for Lucas to know that, however difficult the path had been, they were all finally finding their place. The following week, Laura received an unexpected message from Lucas. A simple, "I'd like to talk sometime, just the two of us." She answered yes, without much thought. They met in a wooded park, away from prying eyes. They sat on an old bench, under the yellowing autumn leaves. Lucas began by saying there was no specific purpose to their meeting, he simply felt they should see each other as adults who share a past, a daughter, and, in a way, a connection. Laura nodded with a slight smile. They talked about Isabella, about the changes, about life. At one point, she thanked him for the way he was handling everything. She said she admired his attitude and that she now understood how much she had hurt him. Lucas looked at her sincerely and said he no longer felt anger, but he also no longer felt love. That respect had been restored with time, but that the romantic feelings had died definitively. Laura replied that she no longer expected to be loved by him, but that she was relieved to know they could at least share Isabella's upbringing in harmony. And with that, they both smiled. A genuine smile, without resentment. An emotional goodbye without tears. And that was, for both of them, the greatest proof of maturity. As the year drew to a close, Isabella prepared for her graduation. It was a momentous occasion, and she wanted both her parents to be present. She asked that no escorts be brought that day, she wanted a photo with just the two of them. Elisa understood and wasn't offended. Laura grasped the importance and accepted. On the day of the ceremony, Lucas and Laura sat side by side for the first time in a long time. They didn't exchange many words, but they shared smiles, tears, and, above all, pride. Isabella walked onto the stage with a firm step, her gaze confident, as if she carried the best of both of them within her. When they called her name and she received her diploma, she looked up to find her parents applauding. It was the closing of a painful cycle, but also the birth of a new stage, more conscious, more human, more real. That night, when it was all over, Isabella took the long-awaited photo between the two. In the snap, there was something no previous pain could erase, the certainty that, despite mistakes, true love still manifested itself in its purest forms. And in that moment, without words, everyone understood that starting over isn't an attempt to erase the past, but to move forward with it, transformed into learning, scars, and, above all, maturity. And so the story, still without a definitive ending, began to write a new page, with less noise, more truth, and a peace built drop by drop. Time, as always, followed its silent and relentless course. The years that followed Isabella's graduation brought subtle but powerful changes. What was once a fragment gradually took on new forms, not to return to what it was, but to consolidate something different, more mature, more true. The pain of separation, the trauma of betrayal, and the days of silence that once seemed endless gradually became memories that hurt less. They were memories that still weighed heavily, yes, but now they weighed differently, like scars that no longer sting, but never completely disappear. And it was from these scars that each person's paths were shaped with a new purpose. Lucas rebuilt his life slowly, but with conviction. His relationship with Elisa, born amid the ashes of heartbreak, blossomed with surprising strength. They decided to move in together after 3 years of stable cohabitation. There was no ceremony, no grand announcements. Just a gradual shift that happened naturally, as everything between them always had. Elisa didn't take up anyone else's space, but built her own with affection, honesty, and respect. Lucas admired her deeply, not only for her patience and emotional intelligence, but also for her quiet steadfastness. She was the kind of woman who didn't need to impose herself to be respected, and that enchanted him. Together, they began to live more lightly, sharing their lives without the constraints of the past. Isabella visited them frequently, and over time, she began to call her father's new home, home. It wasn't to disparage her mother, but because there she felt whole, understood, and safe. Laura, in turn, immersed herself in a profound process of self-discovery. She confronted the shadows she had avoided her entire life, faced her vanity, her fragility, and the pride she so often disguised as strength. She found herself alone many times, but she also learned, in those moments of solitude, to be her own companion. She attended therapy regularly, returned to school, got involved in social projects, and, for the first time, felt she was becoming someone she didn't need to run from. The romance with her old college friend never happened. He reappeared at a vulnerable moment, but Laura knew he wasn't what she was looking for. She needed to find herself again before allowing someone new into her life. And this reunion happened gradually, in small daily victories, a peaceful night's sleep, an honest conversation with her daughter, a day without blaming herself. And, above all, it happened when she realized she no longer needed to justify herself. She simply owned up to her mistakes, accepted their consequences, and decided she would never betray herself again. Isabella continued to grow with a lucidity that impressed everyone around her. She chose to pursue a psychology degree, motivated in part by everything she had experienced. She wanted to understand the human mechanisms that lead someone to break bonds, hurt those they love, and lose themselves. And as she immersed herself in this universe, she understood that not all mistakes are the result of malice, sometimes they stem from unhealed pain, ignored emptiness, and old ghosts. Even so, she didn't romanticize her mother's betrayal. She continued to maintain a respectful relationship with her, but made a point of no longer allowing room for emotional manipulation. With her father, the connection strengthened even further. They became lifelong accomplices, and she knew that if there was a benchmark for integrity and true love, it was him. Even with all the wounds he carried, Lucas never stopped being present, fair, and affectionate. And that was what shaped the woman she was becoming. 5 years after their separation, Laura was invited to give a lecture at the college where Isabella was studying. The topic was, New Beginnings. She accepted with some trepidation, but felt it was time to transform her story into something that could serve others. During her talk, she shared, without intimate details, but with touching honesty, how betrayal destroyed not only a marriage but also her very identity. She said that losing the respect of those you love is too high a price to pay for any momentary pleasure. At the end, she received a standing ovation. Isabella, who was watching in the back row, wept silently. In that moment, she felt neither pity nor anger, she felt pride. Not for her mother's past, but for her courage in owning up and transforming her guilt into a learning experience. Shortly thereafter, Elisa received a job offer in another city, a move that represented both professional growth and a new stage for the couple. He spoke with Lucas, and together they decided to accept the challenge. Isabella already lived alone, so the move wouldn't disrupt their lives. Before leaving, they organized a dinner with their closest friends, and to everyone's surprise, Laura was invited. There was no awkwardness. In fact, it was a meeting marked by kind glances and sincere words. During dinner, Laura asked for a moment of attention and, in a firm, calm voice, thanked Elisa for caring for Lucas and Isabella with such love. He said that if she hadn't shown up, perhaps everything would have been even more painful. Elisa responded with a restrained smile and a wave. Lucas looked at them both and realized that, finally, everything had settled down. On the day of their farewell, Isabella went to the airport with her father. While waiting to board, they sat side by side. Lucas held his daughter's hand and, with teary eyes, told her she had been his strength every time he thought about giving up. She replied that she learned from him that true love never abandons, even when it hurts. And it was there, at that ordinary boarding gate, amid the din of voices and automated announcements, that father and daughter sealed a story that, despite its cracks, never lost its foundation. When the plane took off, Isabella stood for a few minutes looking up at the sky, thinking about everything she had been through. She smiled to herself. She knew she still had many challenges ahead, but now she carried within her the certainty that she was capable of overcoming any pain, as long as she chose the truth. Laura continued her life in the same city, but with a different perspective. She published a book based on her experiences, a work that touched many hearts precisely because it sought not excuses, but paths for reflection. She was invited to events, interviews, and debates. She became, ironically, a voice against what she once represented. But perhaps this is the greatest redemption possible, transforming a mistake into a tool for collective reparation. She never again engaged in a serious relationship, not for lack of opportunity, but because she learned that chosen solitude is better than any imposed companionship. She learned to love herself, and this was more difficult than any other reconquest. This story ends with lives that continued, not like a fairy tale, but like real lives. People who made mistakes, who cried, who reaped the consequences of their choices, but who decided not to be defined by their failures. Betrayal was a milestone, yes, but not the end. It was the breaking point that revealed who each person truly was, their limits, their values, their fears, and, above all, their capacity for transformation. And if there's a lesson in all of this, it's that the truth, no matter how harsh, will always be the only possible path to living with dignity. Comment below with your thoughts on this story. Your opinion is very important to us. And if you liked what you heard so far, subscribe to the channel to continue following impactful stories like this. Remember, betrayal destroys families, erodes respect, kills true love, and leaves scars that span generations. No momentary pleasure is worth the profound pain of seeing a home broken, of losing the trust of those who love you most. And here, on this channel, we make it clear, we never support any type of betrayal. Until the next story.